Welcome back to Human Powered. I'm Jen, and I'm here with Jessica. Hey,
Hey,
Jessica.
hey, good morning, Jen.
Today, we're going to be talking with Sergio González. He was on the Wisconsin Humanities Board for a couple years. He's an associate professor of history at Marquette University. His area is 20th century U.S. migration, labor, and religion. His scholarship explores the intersections between faith and social movements. And in particular, he's interested in the development of Latino communities in the U.S. Midwest. So I think we're excited to talk to him for a whole bunch of reasons. So I think it should be a good conversation.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation with Sergio because I think he's a delight to talk with, and I'm impressed by how he brings together his academic research and his public humanities work, and is really passionate about bridging those two things. His most recent book was called Strangers No Longer: Latino Belonging and Faith in 20th Century Wisconsin. And he has another book coming out that he's working on, and so many projects that we're excited to share. So this is going to be a good conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Well, good morning, Sergio. It's great to see you here.
Good
I haven't,
morning. Good to see you guys.
yeah, thanks for joining us. We were wondering whether you're going to pop on with a costume and a hat or anything from your PBS character.
I
So
left the closet at home. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, we're gonna jump into some of your amazing public humanities work. I think any kids listening, if we don't have a kid audience, but any kids listening, you're a bit of a star on PBS. But we actually got to know each other from working together when you were on the board of Wisconsin Humanities and helped consult one of our historians and consultants on the Immigrant Journeys exhibition, which toured and shared stories from eight people living in Wisconsin who were immigrants from communities south of the U.S. border. And that was fun. And so I'm really excited to talk to you today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Where I first met you, Sergio, was at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press for the very short time I worked there, and you were just publishing Mexicans in Wisconsin. And so when I was looking at sort of all the things you do, it just feels like sort of like this perfect life of the mind because you sort of have this higher level research you do academic work, but you've also figured out how to make it very accessible through public humanities. And so I know Jessica mentioned this, but I'd love to really start with that series you're doing through PBS. We'll put a link in the liner notes for folks just so people can get to it because it's just so well done and accessible and interesting. So first of all, like tell us a little bit about what it is and how you got involved with it.
Yeah. So first, shout out to the PBS Wisconsin team for developing such an amazing idea and bringing together a group of public historians who come from a lot of different kind of walks of life, but who are committed solely to this idea of making history as accessible as possible to middle school students. In a past life, before I was an academic, I was a middle school teacher. That's what I went to undergrad for at UW-Madison, and I had the honor of teaching middle school in Madison. I taught a dual language immersion program, social studies and science, Spanish and English, sixth, seventh, and eighth graders all in the same class, which is as daunting as it sounds. It was definitely like the hardest job I've ever had, but it's made everything after that feel like a real blessing, right? Because that was a really difficult job, but it was also a very rewarding job. And I feel like everything I've done since then has been a reflection of it, right? And trying to kind of get back to that work. So even though, I'm a stuffy professor teaching lectures at Marquette University, that's my day job. I'm always thinking about how I can make all of this academic knowledge that I've been so privileged to engage with as an academic, I can make it accessible for as many people as possible. And that's kind of like my guiding light. And it's always through the lens of being an educator, right? So the question of audience, how many people can I reach? What is the kind of tone that I have to match to make sure that I can reach them where they are? And then also making it an educative experience. And for me, education is always about sparking a sense of curiosity and then planting seeds that I may never get to see them bloom, but the hope is that people who engage with the work that I get to do will one day kind of reap some sort of benefits from that.
Yeah.
That's really great to hear and also pretty inspiring, right? Like I'm not in middle school, obviously, but I wanted to watch all of the episodes. They're all available on the website for PBS. How often is it running?
Yeah, so we are now in season, what is it, season two, season three? Goodness, I don't even know, but we're running so many episodes, and the great production crew at PBS Wisconsin works with us. That's the thing that's really great. It's a collaborative process. They are phenomenal educators at PBS Wisconsin, but they work with the hosts to develop the objects that we're going to focus on, to write the scripts, to reach out to the real content experts that we interview as part of the series. And I think the most fun part, of course, is just to kind of like lay out how we're going to be goofy, right? How do we make these topics, we accessible? We have an episode on bomb shelters from the Cold War period, right? And that's a pretty heady subject. It's got some high level ideas to think about the Cold War and different political ideologies, and then of course there's just the question of like atomic warfare, which is kind of scary stuff to think about. But then how do we make that, how do we create entry points for middle school students to jump into that? And so that's always the fun part, is to like, think about how can we make this engaging, do it in 9 minutes, and to do it in a way that, of course, is like relevant in 2026. So this is not a question of lectures. Obviously, we're not talking about readings. It has to be graphically engaging. And I think also it has to be fun, because we want teachers to come back to these as resources. We want students to come back to them as tools that they can use to better understand the things that they're learning about.
One of the reasons when, after, all the funding was cut and how the humanities councils operate changed. And so Jessica and I were interested in keeping this podcast going in this different way and just talking to people who are doing interesting humanities work and digging into their communities. And trying to sort of like through these conversations show the usefulness and the importance of these tools of humanities. And so one of the things, at least from the little time I spent on this website, that I like about it, in addition to all the things you said, is like sort of using this idea of like almost like a history harvest, or like learning through objects. And so, as a public historian, can you kind of explain to people listening like how that's a useful tool and how people engage with that?
Yeah, object-based history is something that I really learned about when I was in graduate school. When I was at UW-Madison for master's and PhD, I was fortunate to serve as a project assistant for an initiative called Wisconsin 101, which was this effort to kind of understand Wisconsin history through 101 objects. And the idea was never we're not gonna reach 101 objects we actually profile, but it's the journey that we get there to kind of say these are some really cool things that serve as physical ways of looking at Wisconsin history, right? And sometimes they're iconic objects that people know, and sometimes they're not. And I think sometimes history can feel for people, and I think adults often say this to me, even college students when they get into my class. I never liked history because it was about memorizing facts and figures and people's names, and that's so boring to me. And of course, that's not what history is about. History is an argument that we have about the past and what it means for us in the present. And I think the way to do that is to make it tangible. Like, what is the material thing that we can hold on to, literally feel and touch, something that we see when we're walking down the street, maybe something that we walk by every single day, and to use it as this window for us to engage. And these larger questions about what our history is as a community, why we value certain types of history, why we commemorate things. And then, of course, most importantly, I think for a general audience, what it means about us today as Wisconsinites, as Americans, as members of our community.
I really love the sort of premise of the look back, and that's what it's called. I don't think we've said that yet. The look back on PBS, is it's about asking questions, visiting museums and archives, and then this sentence here, telling the story of what has been discovered. So that telling the story is so important, right? It's like it's acknowledging that this isn't written in stone, this isn't the ultimate truth, but instead, what have you figured out about yourself and the world that you live in now from what you are looking back at. And I just think that is really a helpful description both of the program and of history itself. You're obviously having fun when you're doing it too, which it comes through, right? So, were there any episodes that you got to suggest or that you picked or wrote the script for or anything?
Oh yeah, some of my favorites. So my absolute favorite is maybe not the one that is most eye-popping, but content-wise, it's very special to me. And that's the episode we did on the migrant farm worker bed. Just because my personal mission, my crusade is to make Latino history more relevant and kind of available for as many Wisconsinites as possible. And so we use this kind of like dilapidated looking bunk bed that was used by migrant farm workers in Wisconsin in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And we use it as, again, as this avenue to talk about this larger question of labor, of the working conditions that people suffered under here in Wisconsin through the middle of the 20th century. And then, of course, to talk about the reasons that families would migrate to Wisconsin so many times over this decade, right? Not only to work, but to make a better life for themselves and their family. And so that was wonderful. We got to be goofy with it, even though, again, that's a really serious topic. So my co-host Nick Hoffman and I, we're laying in bed and we're eating food and we're talking about these, in a way that's really relatable to anybody who has a bunk bed. But then you kind of dive into these larger topics. My co-host Casey and I, we co-wrote an episode on protest posters on the Vietnam War, and that was a really fun one. Both of us have a real affinity for understanding social movements, and we teach classes at our respective institutions about social movements. And we thought about like how can we get to the nut of what this is, which is like this piece of paper, which is so ubiquitous in any sort of social protest. A lot of people who have participated in them know the idea of like taking a Sharpie and writing on a piece of paper, but how do people come to protest? Why do they move from, anger or dissatisfaction towards actually mobilizing towards something? And how can we use a specific example of the Vietnam War, which at UW-Madison was such an important point for student organizing in the 60s and 70s, as a way of talking about not just history, but a continual process in American history of organizing and social movements.
Wanted just to say something when you were talking about the using the object of the beds that the migrants slept in. So I do storytelling workshops through Odyssey Beyond Bars, and so it was in a classroom of 15 students, and so these are students who are in prison from all over the state, and but they're together for the full semester. And so anyhow, so there was one guy, an older man who grew up as a migrant farm worker in that family. And so the story he told was actually about a bed that he actually had his own bed, I guess, at one place. But so it was interesting listening to the comments of everyone else in the class, because a lot of students in the class like just don't know anything about that history. And so anyway, so it was like so people really connected with the story as he was talking about this bed.
Like there's a lot of prompts I think that are around food to get people talking, but also like the kitchen table, everybody's sort of sat at a kitchen table, and then also like bed, that's a really interesting entry point into a common experience.
I think it speaks to, one of the priorities of humanities work, which is to make connections, right? And you always have to ask yourself as an educator, what is the information, the knowledge that a student walks into my classroom with? And it's the same way when you're making a video, right? What do we think the viewer knows? And oftentimes you have to kind of assume that they don't know much about what you know, because what can you assume about their content knowledge? So you have to start with kind of the basic things. And everyone can think about table fellowship, right? All of us gathering around a table and what the feelings that kind of gives us to break bread and to share this space. And the same goes with the bed, right? Someone having a bed and kind of the comfort it provides, but also people can also think about what it means to not have a space to lay your head, right? And so it opens up this entry point where you as the viewer and me as the presenter can kind of engage on equal footing. And then it's my job as the educator to kind of move you to another step. In educational speak, we call that scaffolding, right? You're creating kind of the ladder you need them to go to the next piece, but you need to start from kind of a space of common knowledge before you can go to that next level.
Yeah, and one thing, this might be random as well, I don't know, but so I remember when my kids were in first grade, and they had like very important person week, and so you
Mhm.
got to bring in an object, and then the other students were able to ask you questions, and I volunteered during this time, and I felt like every single time a kid would show an object, and the questions would actually be, I have one of those too, or
Exactly.
my sister has it in purple, and I had this whole idea of like, oh, so that's how our brains are then. And when does that stop happening? And I feel like it never stops happening. We all want to be like, yes, yes, I have that too, so anyhow, so that's why I just love the whole setup of how this series is, because it sort of hits us all exactly. We all want to think about ourselves, and then if it allows us to think about other people, then it's done its work. So just going back to what you said a few minutes ago, you were saying how one of the ones that was like most important for you to work on, most near and dear, was the object of the migrant bed. And so tell us more about that. I know that that's an important direction in a lot of your other work. So tell us about some of the other things you're doing.
Yeah, so for me, one of my major works as an academic is a really personal one, which is to help kind of retrieve the history of Latino migration and settlement in the state of Wisconsin. My parents are originally from Mexico. When I was growing up here in the state, I never found my community's history really represented in the K-12 curriculum. And then when I went to college, I realized there wasn't much actually academic work documenting my community's history. And so when I went to graduate school, my intention was to try to fill those archival silences as well as kind of the academic silences that existed. And what I learned, of course, is that Latinos have been settling in Wisconsin for over 100 years. You know, we go back into the 1880s and large communities here settling in the 1920s. And what we know in 2026, of course, is that Latinos now constitute the fastest growing and largest population across the state of Wisconsin, right? The last census showed us that every single county in Wisconsin saw growth in its Latino population. So, you know, as an academic, I really want to do my work to fill in those silences because our historical societies have done a poor job, our museums continue to do a poor job of sharing the stories of Latino communities. Again, sharing the narratives of a community that has been here for over 100 years and will be such an impactful community in the future. So I'm really fortunate. I work with a group of colleagues. We started a group a few years ago called the Wisconsin Latinx History Collective. And our job is to kind of, as we say, retrofit the Latinx narrative onto the Wisconsin narrative, which is to say to tell Wisconsinites, you can't tell the story of our state's past, and you certainly can't tell the story of our state's future without thinking about Latinos. And so we are trained oral historians. We teach classes at our universities to train undergraduates to be oral historians. We go out into the community. We ask people to share their stories. We retrieve archives, and then we work with the Wisconsin Historical Society to grow their archival base so that future students of history will have documents to dig into when they want to tell these stories in the future. We'll have those pieces of evidence that they need to be able to tell the history of Latinos who have made Wisconsin their home. And that's kind of, you know, that's a big umbrella project that then kind of feeds into a lot of other things that I do. So when I work for PBS Wisconsin and working on the look back, I'm thinking, how can I take that work and make it accessible to middle school students? When I'm doing talks at public libraries, it's the same thing. When I'm teaching at Marquette, how can I teach my students to do oral history work so they go and recover these stories and contribute to the larger archive? So it's a very much a multi-layered process.
I love all of that, but the part that really jumped out at me is the bringing in the sort of oral history archives into the Wisconsin Historical Society. You know, for if anyone hasn't spent any time going through the archives in there, there's so much you could find. Like, for example, I found an oral archive dating back to a woman who learned how to make bagels in the forests of Lithuania in 1890 and then was like making them in like Marinette, you know, in the 1920s. And so, like, it's so rich to have access to that. And so that's amazing that you're pulling in an archive that people can access.
Yeah, and you
So,
know, and I think it's important to note Jenna, that their archives are so rich, but it's also important to say that they're rich in some ways and lacking in so many others.
yes,
And
definitely.
when I was a graduate student at UW-Madison working on my dissertation on the history of Latinos in the state of Wisconsin, I was continually frustrated with the historical society, the state historical society, but also local county historical societies, municipal historical societies, and the absolute lack of archives that existed on this community. And I'll say this kind of as in a friendly way that the Historical Society over the last 10 years has been very attentive to those criticisms. And they have become a really important partner for the collective and for our team who are trying to work with them. We have agreements that they will be the repository for the work that we're doing. But that was a slow and painful process, I will say. At the
Mm.
beginning, I gave many presentations to the curators and archivists at the Historical Society, who oftentimes kind of looked at me with wide eyes when I told them that there was a history here that hadn't been preserved and that needed to be preserved. And you know, the work that we're doing is one that I think is part of a larger conversation that our state has to be engaged in. You know, our public humanities, our cultural institutions that continue to do, I would say, a quite pitiful job of telling our stories community are doing a disservice not just to Latino Wisconsinites who deserve to have their history represented in their cultural institutions, but of course it's a very dangerous precedent to set for Wisconsinites, you know, writ large, right? Because it, as I argue in the work that I do, my more academic work, that absence, that silence that exists in the archives, that exists in museums, it allows us to continue to see Latinos as newcomers, as foreigners, as exotic people in the state of Wisconsin, as opposed to see them as, you know, constitutive members of the places that we call home. And you both know that the humanities is much more than just the stories we tell, right? They're stories that we tell because they say something about who we are. And so if we don't include Latinos in those stories, it speaks to who we think deserves to be a Wisconsinite as well.
There was a project that received Wisconsin Humanities funding, I believe associated with UWM. I may have gotten that piece wrong, but it was about some oral histories and they were produced, I think, as a podcast.
Mhm.
Um, do you want to tell us more about that? Because
Yeah,
I
I think
clearly
if I
don't
remember
remember all
that
the
one.
details.
The humanities has been such a great, the Wisconsin Humanities has been over the last, decade or so a great partner for organizations that are trying to do that piecemeal work, right? And I think that one of the things that has always been so impactful at the Wisconsin Humanities is it kind of lays those seeds for people to do the work. They might be small projects, but of course you can't build a bigger project without doing that initial footwork. I think the project you're talking about was the University of Wisconsin-Madison Roberto Hernandez Center, which was founded in the early 1970s by student activism, Latino students here in Milwaukee who wanted to have more access to their state institution at the local level in Milwaukee. And so that was an initiative to recover those histories. And then to include it in a series of different exhibits that they had, the physical one on campus, but also the podcast series, where they were allowing people who participated in these protests from the 70s, to have the microphone to tell their own stories, how they organized, and why the Hernandez Center continues to matter today for Latino students and for UW Milwaukee as a whole.
Thank you for that reminder. It was a few years ago and it was an impressive project. Um, and yeah, something we'll put in the liner notes as well. Thank you.
So, Sergio, it's been great talking to you. And before we, move on with our day, I just want to go back to that PBS show, the Look Back, and tell us what's your next episode? What are you doing next?
Yeah, so the next episode I'm really excited about should be out probably the time this podcast episode hits the airs. Is about little golden books and everybody again thinking about those objects that everybody knows. Everybody knows the little golden books with the spine, with the gold, and those were actually born in Racine, Wisconsin, right? So again, thinking about those objects that are ubiquitous around us, they're everywhere, and then discovering that they're actually part of our state's history. So my colleague Nick Hoffman and I are serving as the host for that episode, and we were able to sneak in both of our 6-year-olds into it. So our kiddos are going to make their debut in this episode, and they did a phenomenal job. It's not easy to act on camera, to memorize lines, which 6-year-olds had to do. I already told my kiddo that she has allowed me to start my stage mom career so I can leave my job at Marquette and now just kind of follow her around the country as she begins her path to Disney or whatever it may be. But it was a really great episode because again, we get to see our kids in part of our work, and it shows the blending of the personal and the professional, which I think the humanities always has that, right? We need to have ourselves in this work because if it really does matter to us, we have to be able to share part of who we are in what we're presenting to these larger audiences.
Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure, Sergio. Thanks for spending your morning with us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yep.
Well, that was a great conversation. And as seems to be often the case, it seems like we could have kept asking questions and digging into Sergio's passions for a long time. There's a lot of overlap and interests. And I hope everybody enjoyed that conversation. We're going to put some links in our show notes to the look back. And if you're anything like Jen or I, you'll go down that wormhole and want to watch every episode. Pretty fun to see. So we'll also include a link to the oral history project that Sergio talked about, and some of his other projects.
Yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll be back with another episode in a few weeks.
And thanks always to Chrissy Widmeyer for audio editing, and to the Wisconsin Humanities.